Hey everybody, should be good. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Let me just test the microphone here. Hopefully you guys can hear me. So we'll go ahead and start. Text me if you guys don't get. Okay, that sounds good. All right, great. I know there's a little bit of delay. Okay, so we are in Numbers, and this is Numbers 11. So if you will turn to Numbers 11, I'm only going to go through verses 1 to 23. There is a lot here. I was surprised at how much was here. So I felt from God to kind of limit it. And I believe whoever's speaking next has a lot to say about, or even to a bridge back to what I have said. So we're going to go ahead. It's 1 to 23. And this has to do with complaining and about how complaining and how kind of like having these desires and so forth. And the sort of like wanting. So we'll go ahead and read from Numbers 11. So far, this has been a 3-day journey of actual travel of the Israelites as they move forward. And verse 1 says, "Now when the people complained." Oops, I'm sorry. Let me go back to reading it. My fault. Sorry, I have it up here. Give me a second here. One moment here. Okay. So I'm reading from the New King James Version, in case you guys are wondering. All right. This is verse 1. "Now, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, for the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp." What's interesting about this, and I went through a lot of studies on this, is you might read that and say, "and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp." According to what people read through the commentary, and again, Pastor Mike can correct me on his end, but it looks like it did. There was no actual in the reading. Was no consumption of people. Like nobody actually got hurt. It says there was a fire that burned among them, and then there was this sort of like there was part of the camp that actually got consumed in the outskirts of the camp. So it was almost like a warning shot from God. It's interesting. I kind of think about in our lives how God does send warning shots in our lives out of mercy, and also as just a reminder of his holiness in the midst of his chastening. It's interesting to kind of think about it like any complaining, is just we complain about the wrong things, obviously. And you'll see within this chapter, there's different complaints. There's actually complaints from the people, and then there's technical complaining, but it's really, you can almost say proper complaining from Moses in response to the people's complaining. But this is sort of like complaining about and when you really think about it and we really kind of study this, it's kind of like almost, I always say it's almost, if it wasn't tragic, it'd be comic as far as what they're whining about. So again, Kylan Dietz, which is a very big commentary that I usually go by, it says that they behave like persons who groan and murmur because of some misfortune that has happened to them. In fact, no special occasion is mentioned for this complaint. The text implies that nobody was physically consumed. Only the one end of the camp that was on fire was consumed, and eventually it will be stopped from the prayers of Moses. It says Deuteronomy 4:24, "For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God." It's unclear. It's not very clear as far as how this fire came out. Some say it would have come from the flame, from the fire, the pillar of fire. Some say it could have came from a lightning bolt. There is no specific exact reality of that. Actually, you know what I forgot to do? I forgot to pray before we did this, guys. So help me to pray here. Lord, we just pray for today's message. Lord, I don't want to go before your word here without praying, asking for your intercession. So we just pray, God, that you would help us to Lord, speak unto which, speak through me, speak to what it is that you want me to say, Lord. I pray against scripted, response here. And Lord, help me to be clear in what you have to convey through this actual message. In Jesus' name. Okay. So this is Jeremiah 12:3. And it's, but you know me, Lord, you see me and examine my heart's attitude towards you. That's kind of interesting. And it continues on as far as there's like judgment, drag them off like sheep for the slaughter and set them apart for the day of slaughter. But it's interesting in that specific, Jeremiah there, it's like the examination by God is in the heart's attitude towards God. And it's really interesting because a lot of what this chapter is about is the desire for like the good old meats and onions and garlic and of what that the Israelites were eating in Egypt. That kind of like desire. And then in regards to this is Philippians 2:14-16. Do all things without complaining or arguments, so that you will prove yourself to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding firmly the word of life, so that on the day of Christ I can take pride because I did not run in vain nor labor in vain. So again, we're told not to complain and not to argue, even the New Testament. And again, there's certain things you'll see that we can go before the Lord and say, hey, and cry out to him about things. And this is specifically, when we're complaining about God, complaining about his ways and so forth, and like this and that. And it's interesting because a lot of what we read in this chapter is, again, a very petty want that is like not necessary. And it has to do with food. One thing about believers is that they should not be consistently argumentative, especially to leaders and so forth. How many warnings and correction has God brought through the fire around us to notify us that he is displeased and warning us in love? And it will come. And interesting because the displeasure of the Lord is linked to our inner man. It's our heart, which no one can see. You'll read in this that it's like they're whining about food and if we didn't have these meats and so forth, and garlic and melons of the days when we were in Egypt. They're not happy with the manna that's been provided daily by God, this abundance of food, which they already had. They're not starving or nothing. But they're having this sort of attitude of just like, I want this extra, we want this. And they're just having an absolute emotional breakdown, as Moses kind of makes clear about this. Numbers 11:2, when the people cried out to Moses, then the people cried out to Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. It kind of reminded me of like, there are people out there. There's sort of those that they cry to to their pastors, they cry to those around them, but they don't cry out to the Lord. They don't pray to God about this thing. And it's like nothing happens until there's actual prayer going and speaking to God. Throughout this entire beginning half of this chapter, you'll see that the people of Israel, there's just sort of such a disconnect, even in disregard of God's opinion of the situation, as God will clearly speak through Moses and tell them. They just seem to be totally like, there's this just disconnect. God, they just speak through Moses, like, Moses, do something, and it kind of reminded me, there was a time we were out preaching. Maybe it was I think it was maybe of some friend of ours, and you guys will remember. It's very vague right now, but I remember we were talking about preaching and something like that, and somebody just said to us, keep preaching, it wasn't a matter of like keep preaching as in, praise God, keep preaching. It was just a matter of like, you go and do God's work. I'm good here, and it's sort of like those that leave it to the leadership to do everything. Um, so again, we can find ourselves sometimes like getting, we can this anger against whatever situation that we're in. Most of the times, the situation, if we're honest, especially in the States, is not like life threatening or nothing like that, or we're like, oh, we're hurting or this, that. It's usually some very petty thing. Sometimes a carrot at the end of the stick, to say, oh, life would be so much better if A, B, or C. And we'll complain to our pastors or friends and so forth and say, hey, pray about this, get this taken care of. Well, tell God to get this taken care of. Um, Pastors and leaders have to unfortunately take the brunt and the burden of the complaining. When in reality, again, it wasn't until, in this case, Moses is praying to the Lord that this fire is finally quenched. And it's kind of an attitude of understanding for us. Ask yourself, do you complain? Do you complain, or do you, leave your concerns with things not changing no more to your pastors? Are you asking them to pray about the situation, or are you praying about the situation? Did you take it before God? And again, I see this throughout even like unbeliever family members of mine. They're always like, pray for me. They're scared. They're in surgery, and I'll pray for them and so forth. They'll say, pray for me, pray for me. And then there's that, like, you can pray to God. You can speak and talk to God. God wants to hear from you, Again, there's this disconnect of relationship. And it wasn't it actually is pretty graphic in this whole, the attitude of some of these Israelites, as far as like their attitude towards God. Numbers 3 says, 11:3 says, so he called the name of the place Taberah because the fire of the Lord had burned among them. And speaking of a burning or a place of burning. Now, as we kind of read already, or we're about to read here, it's going to speak about the mixed multitude in verse 4. And I'll go ahead and read that here. So it says, verse 4 to 6, now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish, which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our whole being is dried up. There's nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. So the mixed multitude actually speaks among, it actually refers to, and this is actually hinted, this is brought forth in Exodus, that there were people besides the Israelites that came with them along on this journey. So there's others with that were there as well. And here they are, sort of like this influence on the Israelites. So again, Egypt has always been sort of like the, i.e., bondage of sin and desire to be back. And again, it's interesting because as you read this, if you really take a look at these verses, right, where in specifically even verse 6, but now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. So there's this disdain against eyes. And they don't realize that this very manna that is before their eyes is actually, a pre-incarnate Christ. It says, Jesus says, I am the living bread. This is John 6:48. I'm living bread I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. So again, this is symbolically, according to Jesus, that he was the living bread that came down from heaven. By this way, and again, the mixed multitude here, we're inferring others in the camp besides the Israelites are causing this ruckus. The mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. That's Exodus 12:38. So there's in the midst, there's this sort of like tares among the wheat, so to speak, that are there causing a ruckus there. And just like Israel, we're surrounded in the church and in the world by those that encourage the desires of the flesh, and actually encourage whining and sort of whine themselves, and it just kind of like creates a fire of whining, Um, so what's interesting is it starts with this sort of like reality of complaint, in verse 1, and then now we move on to this complaint about something petty, as in the desire for meat and some onions and this fancy exotic food. um and this is the spurring on of the complaint here. And sometimes we fall into a sort of surrendered, as believers, we fall into a funk or outlook of displeasure, and the enemy comes along and festers and encourages that to grow and to give it ground and to give it an excuse to harbor. And in the midst of that, I think we need to say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Bless the Lord, all my soul, and everything that is within me. Bless His holy name. Those that some people go like, I've heard that before, but it's just like that's what we really need to say in the midst of all of our situations. Notice in the midst of this, there isn't a real calamity. There's no enemy. The food was provided for. They had food, shelter, and they did have, by the way, they had cattle and so forth there. There was meat in the midst. Not enough meat to like, provide for everybody. And we're talking about over 2 million people to have a meal every day, that's like, meat and so forth. But, it's such a petty complaint when you think about it. It's almost comic in a way that it's such a goofy problem that has to go forth in front of Moses, of all things that they got to worry about, Uh, so notice again, there's the exaggeration of this sort of like, oh, woe is me, right? But now our whole being is dried up. Okay, they're not starving, they're not hurting, they're just not. They're not. They're not happy, content with what they have, content with what they have, Um, again, it's just it's emotional. You can sense, you could really feel the emotions in this. Later on, Moses describes it as like a baby crying all over him, as far as their attitude. Do we as believers go about in the same, as we go about in this prosperous and free nation and complain a whole lot? Do we exaggerate? Say, oh, I'm so dried up, in the midst of whatever problems we have. It's interesting. Imagine if today, if we were without food and you're praying for food, it's manifested materially, through the morning dew, and then all of a sudden there's food in the ground, how grateful would you be, that you're actually seeing a supernatural manifestation of food right in front of you from God? And imagine if we woke up tomorrow morning, there was no food, maybe the economy collapsed or something, and you had like, you were told like tomorrow there's going to be food outside your door, and it'll be on the ground, but you can pick it up, you can grind it up, you can, make it into cakes and so forth. And it was enough to nourish and hold you, again, we'd be pretty grateful. Numbers 11, 7-9. Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its color like the color of bdellium. The people went about and gathered it, ground it on millstones, or beat it in a mortar, cooked it in pans, and made cakes of it. And its taste was like the taste of pastry prepared with oil. And when the dew fell on the camp in the night, the manna fell on it. So abundance of food, unlimited food, sweet food. It was described as tasting, having a sweetness of honey. But again, it's you can almost it's almost describing. I kind of like remember like what does what does coriander seeds look like? And I had some in my cupboard. It's basically like Dippin' Dots. They'd be white colored. There is a debate on the color. A lot of people are saying they're not sure the exact color of bdellium, but a lot of people believe it is white, almost in purity. And again, tastes like pastry with oil. It's also described as tasting like honey and just being sweet. Matthew 6:25 says, "Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing?" People grieve and moan over the, again, maximum enjoyment of not having the best drink and the best food and the best clothing. Um, you know, speaking of, Philippians 3:18 speaks of the false brother in and around us. It says, "For many walk in whom I have told you often and now tell you, even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is their shame, who set their mind on earthly things." So their God is their belly. It's all about eating. It's just these sensation. Just really about just that's the end all be all. And not God and His direction for their lives, and God being sufficient. Again, you got to remember the devil's first temptation was food. It was the fruit of the tree of the good and evil. Again, he's at it here again. And again, it's that carrot at the end of the stick. Like, this is something that I have to have. I've got to have the good old meats and it's not just about having it, which they could have it if they slaughtered a calf. They did have calves there they were bringing along their journey. But the fact that they were, like, we had it abundantly and all the time, this extravagance. And yet here is God providing almost a supernatural, you could say extraterrestrial or from heaven delicacy. Again, there's no reason or grounds for this complaint. Numbers 11:10-15. Then Moses heard the people weeping through their families, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused. Moses also was displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you afflicted your servant, and why have I not found favor in your sight, that you have laid the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I beget them? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a guardian carries a nursing child to the land which you swore to your fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all these people? For they weep all over me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. I'm not able to bear all these people alone, because the burden is too heavy for me. If you treat me like this, please kill me here and now, if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness." And again, a lot of church leaders can relate to this. Again, if it wasn't a tragedy, it'd be a comedy. Imagine if your family members of 2 million people plus come to your one door, Moses' door, and you're knocking, and you're in the middle of the night or something, and you're saying, you're wailing in your tears, and you want to eat cucumbers and ribeye. That's the complaint here. And nobody was dying. There was no attacks from any form of tribe in the nearby area. It was all emotionalism, wanting the taste of melons. Again, it's just Moses describes the behavior of the Israelites as big babies crying all over them. Again, he says, "For they weep all over me." Again, when the baby cries and screams, it's doing so, sometimes for a reason. Most of it's because of discomfort or slight hunger. It's not dying, except, what's ironic is that a baby's okay with milk, and these folks wanted meat. It's again, like, imagine if you're a church leader like Moses, and they say, "What's the problem? We have to have ribeye." Remember some. Remember how good the ribeye was back in Egypt. Remember, it had a side of garlic and onion to go with it. It sounds ludicrous. That's sort of like the sort of equivalent of what they're kind of saying to him. Again, ask yourself, how important is God's kingdom come in your requests? Is your mindset on the kingdom of God? That's the mindset of Moses here. There's nothing wrong with making requests before God, but everything you can see, the heart of Moses is just about God. It's just like, and he's concerned, as in you guys will see in probably next week's. His concern is that everybody would prophesy. He'll talk about that. How he's like, if only everybody would prophesy. That's his wishes. His wishes is not ribeye. We're going to soon see. We're going to soon find out here that God is revealing the heart of the people is not the need for, steak and garlic. It's actually despising of God himself. It's interesting how something so, you know, on paper looks so far away from the complaint of despising, the reality of a people secretly despising God, that, and that's what God's verdict is on it. But yet it's being, the face value of it is like, hey, we just want to have, we want meat, it's interesting what's really looking at the heart of man, how it can manifest in the form of a petty want, that despising of God can manifest in this kind of complaining and wanting. The foods mentioned and yearned for by the Israelites has similar in that they were similar. This is according to Kyle and Dietz, or because they were sharp and sour, where the manna was sweet. And this is their commentary. This is the perverted nature of man, which cannot continue in the quiet enjoyment of what is clean and unmixed, but for its own inward discord, desires a stimulating admixture of what is sharp and sour. But the sweet bread of heaven wanted the sharp and sour, which are required to give a stimulated flavor to the food of man on account of his sinful, restless desires and the incessant change of his earthly life. In this respect, the manna resembles the spiritual food supplied by the word of God, of which the sinful heart of man may also speedily become weary and turn to a more penguin production of the spirit of the world. Again, you can see Moses crying out himself in discontent for what was, specifically warranted, And what's interesting, he refers to himself as wretched. He's saying, "Just kill me." That this is the case. He's trying to do the will of the Lord. Again, two different types of complaints here. God is going to respond to him in mercy and give him instruction to ease the burden. We can come to God and say, the burden is too much. Please help with the burden. Jesus said the yoke is easy, the burden is light. Again, Moses' complaint was a language of discomfort and out of despair, which differs from a murmuring of unbelief, and the fact that it is addressed to God for the purposes of entreating help and deliverance from him. Whereas unbelief complains of the ways of God, but while complaining of his troubles, does not pray to the Lord of God. Also know, ask yourself if you are complaining because of the ways of God. Do you complain of the troubles, but not to God? Instead of you complain to God's appointed leaders or somebody else, maybe. Verse 16 to 20 of Numbers. So the Lord said to Moses, "Gather to me 70 men of the elders of Israel." Notice he didn't rebuke Moses here, but he's giving instruction. "Whom you know to be the elders of the people and officers over them. Bring them to the tabernacle of meeting, that they may stand there with you. Then I will come down and talk with you there. I will take of the Spirit which is upon you and will put the same upon them. And they shall bear the burden of the people with you, that you may not bear it yourself alone. Then you shall say to the people," and this is really important to read this, because remember, the people are going to hear what you're about to hear from verse 18 on. They're going to hear this. This is going to be proclaimed to them. "Then you shall say to the people, consecrate yourself for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat, for you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, not 2 days, not 5 days, not 10 days, nor 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have despised the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we ever come out of Egypt?" So really, straight to the point, and quite almost would seem like a million miles away on paper, as far as like complaint for meat and despising the Lord. The reality of the heart is here, and the complaint is like, oh no, I don't despise the Lord, I'm just hungry, I want meat. Huge, again, cutting to the heart, going to the heart of the matter. Now, again, if you as a believer were to hear this from God, let's say you were like, oh, you know what, I got this meat and potatoes I've been eating, I've been provided for. I want, filet mignon for the next 6 months, And God says, okay, I'll give it to you. And you're going to basically, and I'm telling you right now, it's going to come out of your nostrils and then you'll be loathsome. You would think you might want to think twice about listening to that and going, okay, this is a rebuke, this is a strong, okay, I've upset the Lord, but they don't do this. As you'll see as they move on, there will be quail that will come out of nowhere from the Mediterranean. And they will land next to the 2 million moving, and they will eat the daylights out of these quail, and they won't think twice about the fact that God's basically saying, hey, you've despised me. And in the midst of it, there will be, not jumping ahead here, but there will be a plague in the midst of this, abundance all of a sudden. Judgment can come in the form of getting what you want in your lifetime, so much so that it comes in abundance and you just comes out of your nostrils, and you realize in the midst of it that, it just makes you lonesome. These things that get carrots on the end of the stick, you got to really ask yourself, is it really going to be cloud nine when you get it? Are you really going to be, is your satisfaction going to remain forever? Again, the things of this world do not satisfy. Interesting when somebody says, so I just want this, or I just want that. I want this to get going in my life. And, it really, in a way, they could be saying there can be a despising of the Lord in the midst of that statement. It was true at this moment for the Israelites. No, you can make the complaint. No, I just want to eat good, meat and onions, melon or two. I don't despise God. And again, God looks through us like an X-ray to the heart. As believers, we bear each other's problems. Moses was not told to not stop bearing the burden. He was given the opportunity to have other people share the burden. And as Jesus said, my burden is, Jesus said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. The yoke is still there. The burden is still there. It's just been lightened. So there is a reality that we are to continue in these burdens for one another. So again, you can see this crazy reality of the heart. And would you respond if you heard something like that from God? You're wanting this, but really your heart has a problem here with me. That to me is, and do we take that and take it as a warning? For me, if I was there, I mean, you can always say, but you could be like, I don't think I'm going to be eating that quail. I've been rebuked. Maybe I should get in sackcloth and ashes and repent for what I just heard from God. And I always bring this up every time I have service. It seems like God brings me back to the Petra song. I recommend you listen to it. It's called "The Road to Zion's in Your Heart." The journey is a heart change, not a geographic location change or movement from here to the promised land, in this case for the Israelites. But God is moving upon the hearts of the people in, building up faith and trust and love. That's the journey. The journey's in the heart. It's not a location. It's not a promotion. It's not 10,000 converts. It's not a big church. It's really your heart. That's what's being changed. That's what's being moved. We've got to get out of this mentality of some great sort of pivotal moment, wife, 2.5 kids, ministry. That's the end all be all. These are, again, material type things. Whether it be good, there's nothing wrong with a big church. Again, not fame, not fortune, not well financial being either. Again, Proverbs 37:9 says, 2 things I request of you. Deprive me not before I die. Remove falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food allotted to me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. we never really ever want to say it, but lacking can be blessing and a safeguard for us. I mean, we really have to have that mindset on us throughout our entire lives. And actually, it's a way to practice faith. God could give us everything overnight. It's like, where was the faith? It says, without faith, uh, you can't please God. So there is a beauty to the lacking of that we have. It's not saying that we're not fulfilled and God's not going to take care of us and provide for us and meet our needs and even give us these things that we prayed for and desired. We'll go ahead and read 21 to 23, finish it out. And Moses said, "The people whom I am," and Moses said, "The people whom I am among are 600,000 men on foot. And you have said, I will give them meat that they may eat for a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to provide enough for them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to provide enough for them?" So it's interesting. Again, you're talking about, I think it was close to 2.5 million if you include the wives and the kids and so forth. So that's a lot of people to get that much meat. Okay, that's a meat fest. That's a hog wild, And this is a great verse. And again, so many times, I think this should be a verse on a bumper sticker on our cars. I don't know, not bumper sticker, but it should be forever burned in our mind or printed up and put on a wall, maybe even our fridge. And the Lord said to Moses, verse 23, "Has the Lord arm been shortened? Now you shall see whether that I say will happen to you or not." So it's amazing that eventually God's going to bring out of nowhere and quail are going to come flocking in and landing right next to the moving towards the promised land here. Actual, uh, people of Israel. So 2.5 million people. Imagine how many quail showed up. And again, at the time, quail did migrate through the Mediterranean and did land on the beaches and so forth. So they're very close to that. They didn't have to go and get it. It came to them. And they just gathered up as they were kind of moving along, as you'll read later on. Again, verse 23 is huge as far as anything that we battle, anything that we deal with in our life, has the Lord arm been shortened. That's something, to me, that's almost like a newly discovered verse for me as far as what we should be quoting to ourselves. Again, Lord put it on me that we always look at the journey of the Israelites as geographic move towards the promised land, but the journey is the transformation inside us and inside of our heart towards God. Not about righteousness towards the world, but it's really about our heart towards God. We got to kind of get out of this mindset that it's like, when we talk of righteousness, the righteousness is actually the righteousness that comes from a relationship with God. So we kind of put the cart before the house. Like, I want to be righteous. It's like, well, that's when you become more like Christ, because Christ is the righteousness, and part of Christ is doing the will of the Father, loving the Father. This is where the righteousness comes from. Some of us are still in the wilderness on certain aspects, I felt from God, and God's calling us to exit out of that wilderness mentality. And we're in the wilderness in that respects because of our certain stances. And again, just remember the distance of, desire for meat, and despising of God. There's such the separation of those two things of sounding like one, and I can't even believe that it actually means this, is pretty powerful, and that's the workings of the enemy. That's how sin can manifest, and it's pretty elusive, and you would never think it, but God shows the heart there. So with that said, I think I'll just kind of stop there. I felt from God that I should not go on. There's some really great stuff that comes after this, but we'll go ahead and close it with prayer. Lord, we just pray for tomorrow, Lord. Tomorrow's another day. And we just ask, Lord, that we both walk in faith. We walk in understanding of the lack and how it's a safeguard. If we have everything, it's like, do we just, even if we were to have everything, it's kind of think about it. It's like we'd be so busy with everything that we wouldn't have time for you. So sometimes limitation and lack are what you need. And it's not to say that you won't bring us things, God, but Lord, help us with our hearts, Lord. If there's any part of us, Lord, that has these sort of like exotic desires that, there's nothing wrong with certain things that we ask for, Lord, but at the same time, Lord, make us ready for these things in a responsible way so we're not making them into idols, making them into the end all be all. Whereas you and your presence and doing, you said that the food, Jesus said, my food is to do the will of the Father. That's the food. So I pray, Lord, that we would start eating the food, Lord, that is that goes on forever, Lord. It has eternity. And I just pray, Lord, help us to um, be very careful in what it is that we complain about. If we do complain, let us look at the complaint for what it is and examine it. God, help us to walk before you in humbleness, Lord, in these times, and to be content with what we have, Lord, to be aware that our limitations are for our own good, Lord. In Jesus' name. All right, gang. I will see you guys later, and hope everybody is doing good. See you.